Hi, everyone. I know some of you, but I don't know most of you. It's great to meet you.
Want to introduce yourself?
I've heard great things about you in this first year of CoLab, and I know what you're going through because I'm a former CAPE teaching artist as well. My name is Noé Cuellar, and more recently I'm working as research program coordinator for CAPE and program coordinator as well for the after-school program. So all the more exciting for you to have the opportunity to be involved in the research program with our researchers who are near and far at the same time, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. Juana Reyes is the acting program director of early childhood education and associate professor at the College of Education and Social Sciences at Lewis University, which is in Romeoville, Illinois, so relatively close. And Gigi Schroeder, the program coordinator and assistant professor in art education at the Department of Art at the University of New Mexico. So very happy that you're here. So take it away.
Come on up.
Great, thank you so much for introducing us and inviting us here this afternoon to be with you. Juana and I will talk a little bit about our history with CAPE. It's a very long history. Although I live in New Mexico, I did spend a lot of time working closely with CAPE for many years since the early 2000s. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that connects to the research that we've been doing in the last few years with CAPE. Looking closer at CoLab and what happens during this time for teaching artists, children, and also teachers, and how your practices are evolving over time. So we're going to share some of that with you today.
Great.
You want to add anything? No?
No,
Okay.
I think I'm good. Yep.
Okay, so we're going to be mostly focusing on this concept of documentation and what is documentation. We're going to look at documentation metaphorically, thinking about it as like a stone being tossed into water, and how that stone creates ripples that spread out over time. They move and connect with each other, and how they spread out over time, manifesting and connecting into other places and with other groups of people outside of just the classroom, outside of just the relationship you have within the classroom. So our presentation is mostly going to focus on that, but we're going to start first by going way back and talking about how we've connected with CAPE.
So as Gigi just mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about our history and relationship, and then we're going to talk about our research regarding, just briefly about our research on year one, which was 2021 to 2022, and then year two. And then also we'll talk about reflection and how we move forward with the work that you've been doing over the past year. So our relationship it doesn't date back to 1900.
We're not that old.
Yeah, we're not that old. But we both worked at Chicago Commons, actually at the same time. We overlapped. And Chicago Commons is a settlement house that one of the settlement house, Graham Taylor, who was the founder of Chicago Commons, was also worked to be the founder of the School of Social Service Administration at University of Chicago. And this is actually the second location of Commons, which is now Bennett Day School, I believe. And it's right, you can kind of see it off the highway, but this was the second settlement house. Settlement workers lived within the community and what have you. Anyway, Gigi and I also worked at various centers, and this is one example of the centers that was built during our time at Chicago Commons. So that's one of the 7 early childhood sites at the time. I started working there in the early 90s, and Gigi's
Late 90s.
late 90s,
yeah.
yeah. So I was there about 10 years. And then, okay. So just to talk a little bit about ourselves, CAPE and documentation. So one thing that we, at Commons in the early to mid 90s, we decided to explore the Reggio Emilia approach more closely. And in the first years, we really focused on the identity, the image of the child, our beliefs about what we believe in children, and then we also focused on our environment. And then as we got a little bit further down the road with Reggio, then we really realized that we needed to have a more intentional look at documentation and what it meant for us and what it meant for learning within the classroom and beyond. So one thing that was important was documentation was not only like the final product, but it was how to document and learn about, how to build curriculum. It was a way to build curriculum for us. And so CAPE came together with us to, you want to talk a little bit more? No, it's on the next slide. Yeah, okay, good, all right.
So this idea of studying pedagogical documentation was, I met Scott in the late 1990s, and Scott and I were working on some pretty in-depth inquiry projects with young children at Chicago Commons. And what was really inspiring for Scott and the other staff members at CAPE at that time was this idea of documentation and how potentially documentation could be inspiring the teaching partnerships between artists and classrooms and classroom teachers. So this is just a recent, something that Scott emailed, an email exchange that I had with Scott last year. And you want to read it, Juana, since you're closer?
Okay, good. So this is a quote from Scott. So when I first came to CAPE, there was a desire that the classrooms could serve as demonstration sites. The somewhat vague notion floating about was that documentation could help with this, but there were no thoughts on how to engage that. I approached you, Gigi, and we set up the professional development happening at CAPE at Chicago Commons, the NIA Family Center, which was in a previous slide. There, the partners could directly see the impact of the physical documentation, the whole Reggio notion of the third teacher, and how it communicates with the parents and other children, how it can be interactive, and how it moves curriculum. The CAPE artists and teacher partners then began working on their own physical documentation back at their sites and shared displays or panels from that in the late spring.
So I think it's kind of interesting to see how many years ago that CAPE was really thinking intentionally about this use of documentation within the teaching partnerships. And in that email from Scott, he even uses those words like how it moves curriculum, how it, it's not like this final product, but it's used as like as initiating movement. And anyways, I think that's really interesting. So in our work, Juana and I have thought deeply about documentation for many years in many different contexts, and we thought of this idea of process and content, that documentation is both a process and that it also represents content. I'll talk a little bit about this slide and then I'll let Juana share that a little bit further. So in this slide, for example, on the left-hand side, you see a teacher documenting what children are doing in process of painting and creating through videoing and photographing. And then in the center slide, the documentation can also be shared back with students, with children, for their interpretation of what just happened. So it's not just between the teachers, but it's also between the students. And then the students also have a say or an idea of how the curriculum might move forward, how the project might move forward. They may have a different recollection or a different idea of what was going on when you were documenting. And then also in the last slide is an image of sharing that documentation together as adults. So teachers and artists meeting together to look at documentation, not just between you and the classroom or the artist and the classroom teacher, but between other teachers and other artists, so that those ideas can grow even further. So, and that's, this idea of that it's a process of documenting, but it also represents the content of what happened. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Okay, yep. So, did I go back? Okay. Okay, so documentation is gathered during the educational process and the project. So, as Gigi said, it's not just a final culmination, but it's through the process of gathering documentation. Sometimes that helps us expand and change and maybe take a turn with our curriculum. This This documentation gathering includes notes, audio, video recordings of what the students say and do. Also including like still photographs, and they reflect meaningful moments that occurred. Discussing the process of pedagogical documentation, it refers to the artifacts that we use to contribute to the back and forth among students, teachers, and artists to inform the inquiry process. This process entails reflecting, discussing, and interpreting the documentation, and through this process, it informs the collective research. Assembling the documentation for others then allows the classroom experience to be shared with a wider audience, so that they can also learn from that experience and incorporate it perhaps in their own. Yep.
Sorry, I just want to add one more thing. So one of the things that I think is also important is the word research that Juana just used, and we were just talking when we first arrived how this is research. Like I think in education we often think of research and data collecting as tests or evaluation and report cards, and that is research or that as data. But this is data and this is research. So using those terms as documentation as research, and how we are researchers when we study this documentation alongside children and each other.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the first year that we participated in doing research around CoLab, these initial years that partnerships are being formed. And during that year, we highlighted something called an ecology of practices, which is a theoretical framework that looks at the interconnection of practices and then how those practices inspire other practices or how they grow within different contexts. So, for example, CAPE has a practice of professional development, a practice of creating an inquiry question, and a practice of how you might document along the way to then create exhibitions. So there are these practices, but there are also practices that happen within the classroom between teaching artists and the children or the students. So you start to formulate your own practices that are also inspired by the CAPE practices. And then whatever happens within your classroom, it inspires and grows and is shared with others as well. So our first year of research, we started to highlight what are some of those practices that happen within CAPE's network.
And so we looked very carefully at the CAPE professional development framework and thought about documentation, that documentation is a way of considering possibilities, and it's also used as a guide for partnership. So documentation from past projects was shared at professional development, and it informs future projects. So we developed this model of thinking of big ideas and inquiry questions are both past and future possibilities. The inquiry question is embracing uncertainty, this idea of, we talked a lot about in that first year about this notion of embracing uncertainty, which is also borrowed from the Reggio Emilia approach as well. And then also the notion of collaboration and co-teaching, collaborative inquiry, and then kind of leading back up to rethinking about the big idea and questions and future possibilities.
One of the things I find really inspiring about this also is when you think about the students that you work with, the children, is how past experiences or things that children did and said is influencing the future and how that cycle continues. I just think that's a really beautiful way to think about this important work that you do and capturing and making visible the child's perspective and how that then is influencing the future of CAPE work as well.
Yeah. So then we brought this notion of both the process and the product of pedagogical documentation to think a little bit more about moments that happen, about movements, and about how that is manifested, right? So in the second year, this is what we really looked a little bit more closely at. So go. Oh, did you have something else?
Video to go in,
I think it went in the first time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there it is.
Anyways,
Okay,
I took a lot of time making that video.
It's going.
That's a big deal for me.
It's going.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So anyway, this is from some of our thoughts about documentation is that, again, documentation metaphorically is like a stone being thrown into the water. It involves capturing these significant moments that are happening in the classroom, and by collecting artifacts such as photographs, video recordings, the notes, the artwork, and then these documented moments reflect, we say, disruptions to the everyday classroom, because really what's happening in a teaching artist partnership is not the standard. It's not doing school in the same old way, right? And that's what's being made visible through the documentation. The documentation then presents this collection of artifacts for viewing and interpretation with children and also with each other and potentially others outside of the classroom. Like ripples spreading across the water's surface, the recorded moments create movements and actions that lead to new ideas. And these movements or ripples build upon each other, manifesting ideas and actions that can be further shared in multiple contexts within and outside of the CAPE network. So the documentation, again, becomes part of the story of the CAPE network, but it can keep growing and inspiring others. So just emphasizing the importance of documenting, like the act of documenting, and how important it is to be able to share with others, and that it becomes part of the history of something, or it has something to say to others. Now it's going to keep going.
Now it's going to go. Okay. So again, moments are an experience that's captured, or sometimes it's just remembered. Sometimes we don't capture it in the moment because we don't realize the impact until after the fact, right? So it's either something that's captured or remembered, and it reflects the inquiry process. The moment is a memorable experience. And then we think of the movement, movements are reflected upon, when moments are reflected upon with others, so student, teachers, artists, yourself, connections are made and extended. And so that's bringing the moment into a movement. And then
so we're just going to share this as an example from the first year one research. So this teaching artist said, we had certain practices that we would just repeat a lot, like mirroring activities. They would move with the partner, meaning the children would move with the partner and have to watch closely and imitate how they were moving. Then one student came up and suggested that we do mirroring with drawing, like having one person draw and then having the partner imitate that drawing as it was happening. I was like, that's amazing. Yeah, we should do that next for sure. It was cool to see a student be like, oh, I understand what we're doing here, and it could be applied to a different way of making. So let's try that, So I didn't plan to do that, obviously, that day, but we went there because I thought it was cool. So the teaching artist is reflecting on an experience that happened in the classroom when literally she's like documenting a change in the curriculum due to a student's idea. So that's like moving it in another direction.
Mm-hmm. So I think okay. Yeah. Good. All right. So thinking back. So we'd like you today to think back on your classroom inquiry project, and we want you to think about a moment that either became a catalyst for the extension or deepening of the experience of the project, or that strengthened the relationship in the classroom, like maybe between two students, or between the teaching artist and the teacher, or between teaching artist and a student, or however that occurred. And then, or something that one student did that inspired you or someone else's thinking, like the example that we just gave you. So we wanted you to take a moment, and I believe you each picked up a form coming in that has 3 slots on it for moment, movement, and manifestation. And we'd like you to work on those first 2 columns. So what moment would you like to highlight, and then what sorts of things happened around that moment?
So we'll take about 10, 15 minutes, and we'll see where we're at with that. So thinking of moments and movements.
Just the first 2 columns.
All right, so we'd love to hear some of the moments and that happened to you this past year. Would anyone like to volunteer and come to the mic? Is that what we want? No one?
Yeah.
Yeah, we want you to see. Would anyone interested in starting the sharing process of moments? All right, come on up. Come together too, if you. Yeah. Yes, they're recording audio. Good.
You should know.
I know. You want to share one? I'll share the other.
So my name is Juana, and this is Rebecca. We were at Columbia Explorers. I'm the teacher there, and she was the co-artist with me. We came up with two things. One of the first thing was we had kids bring portraits from home with their family members, and they were supposed to sketch an outline. And in the beginning, we were really like, okay, we're only gonna spend like one day on this. You know, we gotta like keep it moving. And we realized that with the kids, they were very intentional and precise with their outlining, and they wanted their photographs to come out just like perfect. So we kind of had that moment where we were like, you know what, we're gonna let them have this moment and like take their time. So for like in the upcoming next year, we were like, we're definitely gonna extend our time on the process, and what we were thinking they were gonna be able to do within like a 1 day time frame.
Mm-hmm. And then also, kind of in terms of connecting between students and teachers, we had a day where they went grocery shopping for ingredients. So I set up a table and I was the grocer, and they shopped for Sculpey clay and chose their colors as their ingredients to then make miniature food based off a recipe that they got from home that like their family cooks. And that was just so fun and silly. And some of them even brought like they had quickly made little dollar bills and gave me tips, and I was like, oh no, this is a free grocery store, don't worry about it. But it was a really, really bonding and really fun and silly, and I think it was already such an amazing group and we were bonding, but that was such a fun and silly moment, and it makes us reflect on like bringing in something silly and fun earlier, because it's just such a great way to create a connection. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
We have another group. Is there another group that would like to share? Okay.
Hi guys, I'm Dalia.
I'm Lindsay.
And we're from Stevenson. So we focus on monarch butterflies and their journey migrating. So I learned too about kintsugi. Okay, I know some cool artists now and you can explain that part, and I'll explain the other part.
It's one of our last days. We were talking about kintsugi, which is the Japanese art form of like filling in cracks or putting pottery back together with gold, with like lacquer and then gold flux. So we were talking about that and how like all we as people are shaped by our imperfections and by the obstacles that we have overcome and like still put ourselves back together. So we were talking with the students were talking in small groups, and they shared some things.
Yeah, so we asked them to share some obstacles that they have overcome, and
They're third grade.
Third grade, yeah. Yes. And I currently have a lot of the newcomers that are coming into the school, so that was really big, and that's why we also focused on monarch butterflies. And they were able to share things that they hadn't shared with even me before, and it was really good for them to make those bonds with each other. So they shared about like parent death and things like that, or like I had a student share that he has a hard time with reading, and how does he overcome that, and how does that make him a better person. So they were able to talk about the obstacle, and then how they could see the positive out of that as well. So it was really nice for them to be able to share with each other.
Yeah.
Who's next? Thank you.
Hello everyone, we're from Stevenson too. We are Viviana,
Anna.
and Anna. Our class is kindergarten students, so it was a lot of fun to work with little ones. So we focused on movement because the whole idea came up from Skyline. This is one of the areas that I had not time to experiment before. So we did our whole main idea around movement. So we talk about different kinds of movements. So one of our movements was what moves through me.
Mm-hmm. And we were thinking about culture and tradition and family history as part of that. So we did a project where the students all were given a leaf, and they used those leaves to depict their family traditions or bring in images, materials, et cetera, et cetera.
Foods, tradition, things that
Exactly.
they like to do. And we were thinking about how to display these leaves that were going to represent everything about them and their family and their culture. So we come up with the idea of building a tree in our classroom. And so we were thinking of doing a 2D shape, but then it was very, I think, and we were in the middle of it, and in the middle of the class, Vivian said, wait, what if you made it 3D? And we were using this brown paper, but like a kind of like a big roll of paper, right? So I started creating these twisting branches and trying to make a three-dimensional tree. And then a lot of the students at the same time were finishing their leaves sooner than we anticipated. So they were coming up, they always come up and say, I'm done, what can I do now? They don't want to sit. They don't want to sit for a second. So they started coming up and asking, what can I do? And it was probably Elijah was the first one. Yes.
Can I help? Always, can I help you? And sometimes if I'm overwhelmed or I don't feel like they can help with the thing, it's more work, right? I say, no, actually the most helpful thing would be you to sit there and work on that. But I said, actually, yes, you can. And I realized that the system that I had just sort of improvised was really simple. It was just ripping paper and twisting it. It was roll, 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 twist. And it was so simple. And so they slowly started coming over. And the class, which was not the plan for the day, turned into this whole branch factory. And we were all, everybody was making branches like crazy.
They were so excited about it. And we end up with a beautiful piece of art in our classroom. So the tree is this big, and it has a lot of the students' leaves in there in display, and they were all so proud of their work. So at that moment, that was a changing strategy for both of us, because we thought, okay, we are gonna move to this because this is what they're moving us to. Mm-hmm. So we had to do a lot of improvising, because little ones, some of them take a lot of time working on something, and some of them are quick. So we had to be improvising and moving on at their speed. And we did the process, again, influencing students among each other, because sometimes they were like, oh, I don't know what to do. So they started talking and giving out ideas. So other friends were like, oh, so he's talking about this, I'm gonna do this on mine. Or sharing out some pictures that they brought from home, and they were connecting to, okay, I also do this, I also like that, because they brought pictures from home to put on their leaves. And to me, this was another way for them to connect with each other, and sharing that they all connect with food, culture, and things that they do at home. And I had a lot of different cultures in my classroom. I have Arabian, Puerto Rican, Mexican, and African Americans, and some of them were like connecting with food, and that was a very nice experience. So they were feeding from each other, and that was one of the moments that we were reflecting.
Like what else did we? We talked about how that moment with the branches in particular, we realized like we had underestimated them, and maybe it was something that we thought only we could be doing, which would have taken way more time, and it sort of this like I need to do it on my own independent teacher mindset, and it actually became way quicker and way more easy and fun when suddenly it was opened up to all the students. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so potentially one more. All right.
Okay, so I'm the teacher of third graders. Wild third graders, but so sweet. Awesome. Yeah, they're awesome at the same time. We started out a unit, Christy came perfectly in because we started out a unit from Skyline as how books serve as mirrors and windows. So it was a good way to, to start having children think about identity, and then Christy stepped in.
So the idea was to do photo-based practices. I do photography and photo-based artwork, and we started with really awesome discussion just about what is photography, but our big idea was silhouettes. So we were making a couple different versions of silhouettes during my time there, and it subtly tied in with the lesson plans, I think, but by the end it really did. So I guess just going off of this framework, because I don't know, we could talk about a lot of things. The silhouettes were awesome, the kids were awesome. We made lumen prints right in her classroom. It was wild times. Every day I was there, I resonate with the disruptiveness. I felt very disruptive every time I was there.
No, it was good disruptive.
But I think the kids enjoyed the disruptiveness. By the end of it, I feel like they understood some of these bigger concepts about what is photosensitivity, because that's kind of a big thing for a third grader, but also just some of the process of photo-based practices, because we had this kind of mini darkroom setup.
Yes.
And by the end of it, they had just a lot of excitement about this process of, it was kind of this analog process where we made these transparencies, negatives of their silhouettes, and made lumen prints out of it. So I feel like they really understood that process by the end of it. And Ms. Cruz and I both got good documentation of that, so I feel like we have good moments of that that action.
They were able to see what they created. They actually, they first did their shadow silhouettes, then they made these lumen prints from the transparent paper, and then they were able to reflect what were they able to see just from their silhouettes and what they cannot see about themselves or what others cannot see. So that's how it tied in with language arts and writing at the same time. Yeah,
because they were reading all these books about all these different types of characters, and they were trying to identify character traits and things like that, and backing up that. Just a lot of reading comprehension, and then learning to write very good sentences. So our final project was putting these silhouettes with their own kind of paragraph of writing about their own identity. And the way it came together, I was ooh,
they were able to share to the class, and it was good.
Oh, that final day was so awesome. So as far as movement, I was telling Ms. Cruz, I think we can kind of build on that more and do a little bit more of that kind of writing reflection. If it's going to be incorporated into English and language arts, I feel like there's ways to build on that, doing a little bit more of that writing in reflection of the photographs, as we're doing it, and not waiting so late.
And it pushed them to write more. My third graders in the beginning of the year, they didn't even want to write a whole sentence. They're like, what, 2 sentences? And then to write a whole paragraph, that motivate them. Okay, I wrote this whole paragraph. So when they seen their finished work, they were excited, they were fighting who's going first to present. That's how motivated and engaged they were.
They were so awesome.
Yeah.
They were very cute. Because it was talking about, they wrote a little paragraph about what you can see about them in their silhouette, but all the things about them that you can't see. Yeah. And it was just the most adorable thing. Third graders are awesome.
Yeah,
I loved it.
So thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna, everyone's gonna have more opportunities to share what happened for you last year, but thank you for those who came up to the mic and shared those stories. I think it's also interesting after all of us hear what happened in the classroom, how that also impacts us and how we think about our work with children and what could happen in the future. But Juana and I were taking notes, we were listening carefully, and some of the things that we heard in those short conversations I think are so meaningful about what happens in these kinds of inquiry projects these stories that often don't get told. And so we're just going to share a couple of some of the things that we heard. One of the things I heard was a lot about bonding, like relational learning and bonding among children, students, and I'm sorry, we're early childhood people, so I always say children, not students. just that I'm speaking of students, older students as well. But so that bonding, relational learning, and that learning is an emotional process. That it's not just black and white, it's not just clear cut. That there's emotions involved, including frustration and happiness and joy. But those are all part of the learning process. And that changing the direction or that failure is generative. So that when something doesn't come out the way you think it is, that's also a generative opportunity, that it can generate something new, a new process for doing things. And also one of the words that we heard also a lot of CAPE teaching partnerships use is the word improvise. And that is such an interesting word, and also a practice, improvise as a practice is super interesting. And this image of the child, or image of our students as being strong and capable and having a perspective and a point of view that's important in the direction of the project.
Yeah. So I noted some of similar things as you did as well, but also this idea when I think of, sorry. Okay, so also the notion of improvising makes me think about that idea of embracing uncertainty. So I love that, I love hearing about the risks that you were taking with children. Sometimes it is when you have a boisterous class of second graders or first graders or 12th graders, whatever it is, that you want to instill like a sense of control over the classroom. But then when you really listen to their voice and work with them as they, allow them some give and take and some agency over what's happening in the classroom, then that idea of managing the classroom becomes a moot point, because it's, your things are unfolding and the students are taking part in what you're doing, and they have some sense of autonomy and agency and ownership, and then they it also reinforces their identity and reinforces your view of who they are and who they can become as well. So,
okay.
Did you want to go back to us?
Yeah. Is there anything anyone else heard from someone else that you were inspired by? Something someone else said. I'm just going to go back to this slide for a second. This image on the right-hand side is from 2001, but this is a document. What we refer to in the language of Reggio Emilia as a documentation panel, which is very different than a bulletin board, a traditional classroom bulletin board, meaning that a bulletin board is often just the student work and maybe hung up in a very neat and clean kind of way by the teacher, and every child's artwork is shown. And a documentation panel, it shares a story in a deeper way of what happened. So it's like the backstory of how we got to the completion of the final work, or how we got to the end of the story. It tells the whole process of the story. So this particular documentation panel is from a study that we did with preschoolers on, we were studying hands and the uniqueness of what hands are for people who, each of us, our hands are different, and how we use them is different also. And one of the things we did during that study is we went out into the community, or this is in the Pilsen neighborhood, we went out into the community to study how community members use their hands. So we were taking photographs, and the children were also doing drawings of the hands, and also they made clay hands representing the motion or the movement of what was happening in the community. So the documentation panel, again, is not, it's not just the artworks, but it's also the photographs of what happened during the study of looking out in the community. It's the children's words, what they were saying in response to studying the community of hands, and then also their drawings is part of the documentation panel as well. So the documentation is represented in these different formats, not just, again, the final artwork. So that's just something to think about as you're documenting, is how photographs can also become part of the, your final product, which I know you're thinking about along the way as well.
So
Okay, so we're going to do one little last activity, is after now hearing some stories from others and also reflecting on your own, what are you thinking about moving forward, revisiting, extending, or revising for the next year? It could even be influenced by something you heard from someone else's story this year that you want to think about within your own work. But we'll take just a little bit about time to do this, and then we're going to move on to doing something else. But let's just take a few minutes to think about what are some ideas that you have for moving forward for next year. All right, let's come back together. So anyone want to, could we have a group share, what are you moving forward? Something you're revisiting, extending, or revising for next year? Who would like to share? Thank you. I think you got to come up to the microphone. Yeah. That's the fun part.
Yeah.
So we have juniors at Taft and the IB program, and we are still in the middle of it, actually. We're going to the very end. And we're doing linoleum cuts that they will be finally able to print next week. So we were actually talking about what you all were talking about that time to kind of like decompress and understand and reflect and revise, even though we haven't gotten there yet, building in time next year to give them more of a chance to be able to print their work, see how it's very experimental. Some students are printing on paper, some students are printing on like leaves and other things. They've been encouraged to really experiment with what the surface could be and how that changes the meaning. So since we're in such a time crunch, just thinking about how next year to be able to really allow more time at the end so that they could do all of this and then go, okay, like, what does this mean? What do we do now? How do we further develop it?
Yeah, and all of their work is centered around a theme that they pick. So depending on their conclusions of how they examine what they've made and how they can change it moving forward, the next piece that they make can be in any medium that they've learned thus far, but it should be like a continuation of their story, of their theme.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Doesn't have to be a lot, extract. Something you're thinking about moving forward for next year. Okay. Thank you.
So something that we talked about is that we have a lot of artists already in our classroom, so having the students take lead in some of the art projects or being an example to others would be nice for next time so that they feel more included in the project as well. And then kintsugi, they really like those new techniques. So we also talked about showing them different techniques and then being able to apply in the same day. I think that really stuck with them when we did that. And then I really liked what you guys, different groups said about adding writing to your artwork. So I think that would be nice too, because I also teach 3rd grade, so getting them to write more, especially about art, is going to be a great way to get them into that.
Yeah, we did a final exhibition on the last day, and they were able to talk to other students about their art, but I think having an opportunity for them to like write and reflect with each other would be great.
Before they had that, because they were just shy.
Yeah.
So being able to process that before other students came in would have been nice too. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting how when you think about moving something forward, you'll have like a totally different group of students, right? So, but there are these things that you learned along the way that you can always, are really helpful, I think, for the next class. So before we move into the next thing, did you have any questions about documentation? And we use this word pedagogical documentation, meaning that it's about teaching and influencing teaching and learning. Was there any questions you had logistically? Not that we're total experts, but we have been doing this work for a while, so just wanted to open up for any questions.
No.
Quick question. So
Sure.
when you say you're documenting, you are just in the pictures, you're reflecting, and then you're keeping your notes
Yeah.
for yourself. Is that what you're doing by documenting? Like, just keep constant notes of what you're doing.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
documentation can be note-taking, with photographs or collecting little pieces of what's happening. Even if you do a little sketch of what's happening with the students. Yeah, it can be words, it can be a sketch, it can be also a conversation that you have with each other.
Yeah.
Something that sticks in your head and you want to think further about. All of that, to me, that is what curriculum is. It's not something that we buy from a publishing company. It's really alive. Curriculum should be much more dynamic than what ends up happening oftentimes in schooling.
Just like you were saying,
Yeah.
like every year you have different students.
Yeah.
I'm in the process of doing something with my kids, and it is very crazy, but I'm thinking constantly to myself, like, ooh, I should do this next year. This is going to improve this. This is so that is just constantly in my mind, but
Yeah.
I don't actually write it down.
Write it down.
Definitely write it down. Yeah.
Next thing
Yeah.
I know, oh, I forget.
You know what I think is interesting about even I don't know if you've ever kept a diary or a journal, personal one, but like certain ways that you experience something, you can't always just remember it. You can't always get there with just a memory. But if you write it down, it becomes
Or draw a
in the
picture.
moment. Or draw,
Yeah,
sketching,
whatever.
writing
Yeah.
it down.
Yeah.
Even if it's just a few words,
Right.
it can get you to that memory in a deeper way than just storing it. For example, or just thinking that you're going to remember that later on. And sometimes there are things that happen that you won't remember, but are really significant. So
You're in the moment, like, ooh, I
until
thought I was gonna do this. I was not gonna do this.
yeah, even a photograph, I think sometimes can get you to that memory, just as writing about it does. But yeah, that's a great question. Yes.
So I guess my question is because I will write it down,
Uh-huh.
say I'm gonna do it, and I don't go back to that journal to look to see what I said I was gonna do.
Yeah.
And so I'm finding myself like, oh shoot, I said I would not do this year. So then how often do you guys reflect on your documentation?
Well, in the world of Reggio Emilia, it's a weekly event where teachers come together to study documentation. But it can be whatever. I work with a group in New Mexico. We do it monthly. We come together to share documentation. So developing a practice of it, I guess, whatever works for you. Yeah.
And I really like the idea of you having us share, because hearing them sharing their comments about what they did, we are talking about implementing something else.
That's
next
it.
year, and
That's
that
it.
is very
That's the movement. Or manifesting, yeah.
Also, I encourage us to think about, I know that some of the programs or some of the schools that you work with are very diverse linguistically as well as culturally, to think about all the languages that children can, and that, students and you all can represent work. So when I think about, a couple of people said that they're gonna have the students write about what they're doing. I think that's really important for them to think about. That's a whole other way to reflect and a whole different perspective on artwork, because if you have to write about what you're thinking, it's different than just standing up and talking cold, right? That it's tricky to do that. But just being able to write and plan that out helps anyone really kind of conceptualize better, right? I know that when we worked with teachers, we had teachers present their own work. So it wasn't us presenting for the teachers as administrators or as coordinators, right? But we had the teachers present their work, and when they had to go back and reflect on what they were doing and why with children, it brought a deeper sense of understanding as well. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. Great. Okay, I think we're ready to transition with Mark.